All right, great. We are getting ready to start here. Let me see. How are we doing on people? Good, people are starting to come in. I always rush things, and so I will try to speak slowly as we start. I'm Angela Brintlinger. I'm the director of the Center for Slavic, East European and Eurasian Studies here at Ohio State, and we are so thrilled to be able to collaborate with Professor Mark Bender and bring this lecture to our population and to his class in the Department of East Asian Languages and Literatures. So I'm going to see, I think we have a few more people who might be coming. I get to do the introductions, which is rather fun. Our guest today is Professor Kenneth Yin, who teaches languages, literatures, and linguistics at the City University of New York. His scholarly work centers on the Dungan literature and culture of Central Asia, as well as the Tungus literatures and cultures of North Asia, namely Siberia and the Russian Far East, with a focus on Udege and Yevenk. He was very careful to help me with my pronunciation, which makes me sound a little bit less like Pushkin and a little bit more, perhaps, of an expert in these areas. Professor Yin is a graduate of Cornell University and Georgetown University, and he has received fellowships and awards from the American Council of Learned Societies, the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation, the National Endowment for the Humanities, the Davis Center for Russian and Eurasian Studies at Harvard University, the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, and the City University of New York. He's the author of Dungan Folktales and Legends, and also Mystical Forest, collected poems and short stories of Dungan ethnographer Ali John. So I think that's my duties. The only other thing I will say is that we are happy to, you can see that the closed captioning has been enabled. If you would like to see that, you can do so. We are recording this session for people who may want to see it later. And Professor Yin will be speaking for, call it 40 minutes, and he's happy to take Q&A after. We have two ideas. One, if you'd like to write, if you're more comfortable just zapping us a note in the chat function, I'll be reading those questions and we can make sure to take those into the conversation. We're also happy to have people raise their hands and then we'll find you and we'll call on you and you can unmute and ask your question in person. It's not too formal. But we want to make sure we have a friendly classroom environment and that everyone has a chance to ask questions if you have any. So with that said, I would love to turn the microphone over to you, Professor Yin.
Thank you so much for the introduction. I would also like to thank the OSU Center for Slavic, East European, and Eurasian Studies, and the Department of East Asian Language and Literatures for sponsoring today's lecture. So the slides are not going forward for some reason.
Maybe you might want to refresh the screen share.
Okay, so refresh the screen. How do I do that?
So you'll need to stop share and then reshare your screen.
Okay. So let me. So here we go. Can you see that now? No. Are you able to see that, everybody?
No.
No, okay, I have to share the screen. Okay, let's try. Sorry about that. Can everybody see that now?
Yes.
Okay, great. Here we go. Yeah. So as Professor Brintlinger said, the topic of my talk is Dungan Folktales and Legends, which is based on my recent publication from Peter Lang Publishing in 2021, and which is volume 16 in its International Folkloristics series. And this is the Sino-Muslim Folkloric narrative tradition of Central Asia. Okay. So I'd like to begin by briefly discussing the significance of the study of the Dungan folkloric narrative tradition. So first, there is the existence of tale types that are not found in other folkloric traditions. Secondly, the Dungan folkloric narrative tradition forms the basis for the development of Dungan written literature in the Soviet period. And then third, the narrative tradition provides evidence for the complex ethnogenesis of the Dungan and Hui people, who are the Sinophone or Chinese-speaking Muslims of Central Asia and China. Okay. Today's lecture is broken down into two parts. First, I'd like to provide a brief introduction to the Dungan people and language, as I believe most people will not be extremely familiar with the Dungans. And then I would like to move to a discussion of the general features of Dungan tales. These remarks based primarily on Rifkin's 1977 structural and comparative analysis, which is in my 2021 English language edition. Okay, so the Hui people, or in standard Chinese and Mandarin, Huizu, are the Sinophone Muslims in China, and they are considered an ethno-religious group, and they number approximately 10.5 million according to the 2011 Chinese census. And as you can see on the map here, they are distributed throughout China, mainly in the northwestern provinces and the Central Plain, or Zhongyuan region in Chinese. So the Hui are one of 56 ethnic groups officially recognized by the People's Republic of China, or PRC. So, and the PRC government defines the Hui to include all historically Muslim communities not included in China's other ethnic groups. Okay. So I'd like to make a few comments about the Dungan or Hui migrations to Central Asia. So they crossed via the Tian Shan or Celestial Mountains. So in the first wave in the winter of 1877 to 1878, and this was in the immediate aftermath of the failed Dungan revolt, which lasted from 1862 to 1877 under the Manchu-led Qing dynasty. Then there was a second wave of migration from 1881 to 1884, following the signing of the Treaty of St. Petersburg in 1881, which restored to China the upper Ili Basin in Xinjiang, which had been occupied by Russian troops since 1871 during the Dungan Revolt. And third, and more recently, in the first part of the 20th century, there has been another migration, and this has lasted until the border between the Soviet Union and China was closed in the early 1960s. And this was following the Great Chinese Famine, which lasted from roughly 1959 to 1961. Okay, so where do we find the Dungans today in Central Asia? So if you look at the map here, you see in the green hatched area that they are primarily in Kyrgyzstan, in Kazakhstan, and in Uzbekistan. So just a few comments about the Dungans generally. So by tradition, the Dungans are Sunni Muslims of the Hanafi school, like most of their Central Asian neighbors. Most of the original Dungan settlers were poor, illiterate peasants or small urban craftsmen from Turpan in Xinjiang, from Gansu province, and from Shanxi province in China. The Dungans have traditionally had large families, often with between 6 and 8 children, and they enjoy a reputation as a hard and prosperous people. So these comments that I'm making, both about the migrations and these general comments about the Dungans, come primarily from Svetlana Rimsky-Korsakov-Dyer, and one of her research monographs in 1992 focused on the Dungan settlement in Karakunus. So according to the latest census data available as of 2020, there are an estimated 150,000 Dungans. And this is the figure that I cite in my 2021 edition of the Dungan Folktales and Legends. And the numbers are roughly evenly split between Kyrgyzstan and Kazakhstan. Approximately 74,000 Dungans in Kyrgyzstan, according to the 2020 Kyrgyz census, and slightly over 72,000 in Kazakhstan, according to the 2019 Kazakh census, and approximately 3,000 in Uzbekistan, according to 2009 estimates of the Dungan Cultural Center of Uzbekistan. And interestingly, more recently, there's been a migration of Dungans from Central Asia to Saratov Oblast, which is located in the southeast of European Russia. And this migration beginning only in 2000, with 1,650 Dungans approximately counted in the 2010 Russian census. Okay, so now I'd like to begin to talk about the language situation with the Dungans, which is very interesting. So when the Dungans first arrived in Central Asia, they brought with them something called Xiao'erjing, which is a Perso-Arabic script originally used by the Dungans and also by the Hui, and still used by the Hui in China. So if you look at the screen here, you could see a sample of the Xiao'erjing, which is in the lowest row here. And this is an excerpt from a Chinese Arabic Xiao'erjing dictionary published in 1955 in Shanghai. So literally meaning children's script in Chinese, or minor script. Xiao'erjing, however, was primarily used for annotating religious texts, and this prior to the Soviet period. So what happened once Soviet power was established? was first the adoption of two different Latin alphabets, and the first being adopted in 1928. So during the years 1928 to 1929, as the Kyrgyzs, Kazakhs, and other Turkic-speaking peoples of the Soviet Union were adopting the Latinized alphabet known as the New Turkic alphabet or New Alphabet, the Dungans adopted a Latinized alphabet based on the New Turkic alphabet, but adapted for languages of peoples of non-Turkic origin, right? The Dungan language being a Sinitic or Chinese language. By 1932, however, the new Latin Hua began to replace this first Latin alphabet. The Latin Hua movement was spurred on by the fact that Muscovite political workers at the Scientific Research Institute on China, a unit of the Communist Academy, were joined by highly qualified linguists and sinologists from the Academy of Sciences in Leningrad. Okay. So from 1939 on, the Cyrillic alphabet gradually replaced the various Latin alphabets for all the national minority languages in the Soviet republics of Central Asia. The most important motivation for this switch was the desire of the Soviet government to facilitate making Russian a unified language of the USSR by having a single alphabet taught in elementary schools for Russian and the minority languages. With the change delayed in some areas by the war and its aftermath, the implementation of a new Dungan alphabet based on the Russian script with 5 additional letters, however, did not occur until 1953. And there was experimentation with this Cyrillicized alphabet over a period of 2 or 3 years, but it was finalized in 1955 and is still in use to this day. So Dungan is notably the only Sinitic language that is officially written using an alphabet, or in linguistics, what is called a morphophonemic system, instead of Chinese characters, which constitute a morphosyllabic system. And the Dungan language has received a lot of attention from linguists because of this particular fact. An internal diglossic situation stems from the fact that Dungans are divided between 2 different dialects: the Gansu dialect, spoken mainly in Kyrgyzstan, and the Shanxi dialect, spoken predominantly in Kazakhstan. While nearly half of the young generation today has little or no mastery of Dungan and can only speak Russian and sometimes also Kyrgyz or Kazakh. The Dungan language is listed by UNESCO as a definitely endangered language, since it is primarily the parental generation that speaks the language. Okay, now I'd like to briefly turn our attention to the 3 collaborators on the study that I'll be discussing. the editor of the 1977 Russian study that I have translated for my 2021 English language edition is Boris Lvovich Rivstin. He lived from 1932 to 2012. I was very fortunate to be in contact with him from 2005 until briefly before his passing in 2012, as I was working on the English language edition. And he is also known by his Chinese name, Li Fuqing, because he was so proficient in Chinese that he authored quite a few research monographs in the Chinese language. He is a pioneer in the study of Chinese popular literature, folklore, and visual culture. And he was also a doctor of philological sciences. The second collaborator on this large study is Mahmoud Akhmedovich Hasanov, who lived from 1932 until 1977. Unfortunately, he passed right before the publication of the Russian language edition in 1977. He was a Dungan writer, literary scholar, and candidate of philological sciences. And he is considered a leading expert in Dungan folklore, as well as an influential Soviet Dungan prose writer of the 1960s and 1970s. And he happened to be fluent in both the Gansu as well as Shanxi dialects of Dungan, because he had lived in both Kyrgyzstan and Kazakhstan. And finally, the third collaborator on the large research study I'll be discussing was Ilyas Ismailovich Yusupov, who lived from 1930 until 2005. He was a Dungan historian and candidate of historical sciences. And he was a prolific researcher in Dungan history and philology, who published more than 100 scholarly works during his lifetime. Okay. So now I'd like to speak about the analysis of Dungan folk narratives. So the analysis itself uses the Arne-Thompson folktale classification system. And the general findings are that there is a firm rooting of the folk narratives in Chinese storytelling traditions, but that there is also substantial Middle Eastern, East Asian, and Central Asian influence, as we will see. I'd like to discuss briefly the different editions that exist now of the Dungan tales with critical analysis by the three researchers that I just mentioned. So on the left of the screen, you see the cover for the first Russian language edition of the Dungan Folktales and Legends, Dunganskие народные сказки и предания. So this was published by Nauka Publishers, as I said, in 1977 in Moscow, and it was actually part of a series titled Tales and Myths of Eastern Peoples, and it drew quite a bit of attention at the time because of its inclusion in this series. The second Russian edition, which you see in the middle of the screen, was published more recently in 2013. And there was an abridged edition whose cover you see on the far right that was published in 2018. And that abridged edition only includes those tales that were specifically translated into Russian from Dungan by Riftin himself. And then finally, there was a Chinese language edition whose cover you see on the left. Dungan Minjian Gushi Chuanshuo Ji, Collected Stories and Legends of the Dungans. And this was edited by Li Fuqing and translated by Hai Feng in Shanghai by the Shanghai Literature and Art Publishing House. And of course, on the right, you see the cover of my own 2021 English language edition, which I've already mentioned. So what I'd like to do now is show you briefly the titles and the three large chapters as they appear in my English language edition. So there are the first of the three sections I've translated as Wonder Tales and Animal Tales. So this particular section consists of 40 selections total, and you can see the first 20 on the screen now. And here are the other 20 selections that comprise the Wonder Tales and Animal Tales, right? The second chapter in my book is titled Novelistic Tales, Folk Anecdotes, and Adventure Stories. And this chapter consists of 27 selections, as you can see on the screen. And finally, the last chapter is titled Legends, Historical Tales, and Narratives. The narratives here is a translation of the Russian skazy, so the colloquial sort of third person types of narratives. And a lot of these are the longer selections in the collection. So the length of these three chapters are about roughly equal. Okay, so now I'd like to talk about the 8 general features of Dungan folk narratives as they are discussed by Riftin, Hasanov, and Yusupov, and are included in the my translation of the critical introduction in my 2021 edition. So first, a brief comment about tale typology. So Dungan categorization of oral prose narratives is basically into 2 types. So the first being called gujier in Dungan, which are typical folk tales, so the shorter tales, and then what's called faux in Dungan, which can be compared with Beijing Mandarin shuoshu, or storytelling to music, which are literally book stories or those with a basis in the Chinese literary tradition, and therefore the longer tales. And on this particular screen, you can see a beautiful oil painting by a wonderful young Dungan artist, Abdus Samad Karimov, and this is titled Ancient Turkestan. Second, I'd like to make a few comments about the origins of these Dungan folk narratives. So there are Far Eastern and Near Eastern sources for the narratives, and this reflects the complex ethnogenetic and cultural ties of the Dungan people. There is also a down-to-earth nature of the fiction of the Dungan tale, especially a wonder tale. And this links it to the folklore of Far Eastern peoples. So the action in Dungan tales, as for instance in Chinese tales, takes place not in some distant and unknown realm, a land of fantasy, but rather all the uncommon occurrences happen with the hero or protagonist nearby in places native and familiar to the storyteller. And on this particular slide, I'm featuring an oil painting by arguably the best known Dungan artist, Muhammad Umar Panshayev. And this particular oil painting is titled The First Dungan. Okay. The next general feature that I'd like to discuss is narrative time in the Dungan folk narratives. So there is a general lack of localization in time in the Dungan stories. And this is a contrast to the tales of a number of peoples of the Far East. For example, the Chinese and Koreans, who are generally inclined toward legend or tradition, which often specifically indicate the time of the action. For instance, during a particular dynasty or under a particular ruler, a particular story happens. In Dungan tales, wonder tales, and everyday tales, whose connection with legend is considerably weaker, these kinds of introductions localizing the action in time are hardly ever found. The tale usually begins simply with words like "there once was" or "in the old days there was," attributing the action to an indefinite past time. And on this particular slide, you can see another oil painting by the young Dungan artist, Abdul Samad Karimov. And this particular painting is titled Autumn in the Mountains. So the fourth general feature of the Dungan folk narratives that I'd like to discuss is physical landscape. So the world of the Dungan tale has its own specific landscape. And one of the features of that landscape is the frightening and dangerous mountains. And this can be compared to the frightful forest seen so often in European tales. Then there is reference to the plain, which is usually inferred in a Dungan tale rather than specifically described. Next, there is mention of the sea. For example, the East China Sea, where the Dragon King, or Lun Wan in Dungan, dwells. But interestingly, no mention of lakes or rivers. And then finally, there is mention of cities. And usually an abstract, quaint Chinese city, however, rather than a specifically named one. And on this slide, you can see another beautiful oil painting by Muhammad Umar Penshayev. And this particular painting is titled Mountain Dwelling, China. The fifth feature that I would like to discuss is the common character types seen in the Dungan folk narratives. So you will encounter in these narratives farmers, shepherds, petty traders, woodcutters, hunters, keepers of coaching inns, bandits, officials, and sovereigns. There is, however, scant mention of craftsmen, of whom there were many before among the Dungans, but frequent mention of petty traders. For example, owners of small shops, or those walking around the villages with a yoke and baskets selling fabrics, decorations, or other trifles. And then there is quite a prevalence in the tales of coaching inns with their innkeepers and assorted guests as the place where the action in many of the Dungan tales occurs. And then there is the frequent mention of immortals. For example, Shen Xian, always a positive character in the tales, as well as the holy Hizir, whose depiction is typical in Near Eastern and Central Asian folklore. And then, of course, readers will encounter the varied fantastical characters. So you will see monsters, for example, elementally linked with Far Eastern mythology. For example, shape-shifting jinn who seduce their victims, as well as shape-shifting Youguai who forcefully abduct people, and then Ye-Mou-Ren, the hairy wild man cannibal, as I've translated it. And then there are also monsters common in Central Asian folklore. For example, Mengguzi, who is a seven-headed monster and who can be compared with the Mongolian mongoose and Gansu Mongor Mangguzi. And then there are characters of the Near Eastern and Middle Eastern mythological sphere. For example, giants Dai Wuzi, as I translated it, whose name is ultimately derived from the Iranian Dev. And then, as I've already mentioned, there is the Dragon King Lun Wan, the Master of Water, whose depiction emerged on Far Eastern soil, but under the influence of Indo-Buddhist mythological religious beliefs. And then there are also these fantastical characters linking Dungan folklore with the Turkic. For example, Tuzi, a bald head or mangy person who can be compared with old Turkic Taz, a cunning trickster or lucky cheat. And then there are also familial relations, exemplifying the idea of filial piety and punishment for undutiful children, this being mainstreamed under the influence of Confucianism. And on this particular slide, you see an oil painting by the young artist Karimov. And this painting is titled A Dungan Bride Receives Guests. Sixth, I'd like to make a few comments about individual motifs and plots in the Dungan folk narratives. So there is the depiction of the societal relations of Old China in modified form. So, for example, heroes encountering officials or emperors who seem closer to the common people than in the tales of the Chinese. And then there is also frequent mention to two kingdoms and two sovereigns, respectively. And this is possibly preserving memories of the periods of temporary fragmentation in China in the Middle Ages, or memories perhaps of ancient tribal chiefs or clan leaders in the south of China. And this is according to Wolfram Eberhard, 1937, or perhaps the borrowing of plots from the folklore of neighboring non-Far Eastern peoples, presumably mainly Turkic peoples. And then we also see the hero or protagonist going straight to the capital and easily obtaining the title of Zhuan Yuan, or number one scholar, in what is depicted as a much less complex system of government examinations than in reality. And this is a possible link between the popularity of the Zhongyuan in Dungan tales and the influence of Chinese ancient drama and the traditional auspicious popular print. And then there is also an often positive and deferential attitude seen toward the Yuan Wai, a typical character in the tales who can be compared with the Pomeshchik of the Russian tale. And then there is the infrequent appearance of the Ahun, a Muslim clergyman who can be compared perhaps with a mullah, whose depiction is never found in Chinese folklore or Far Eastern folklore generally. And then there are the folklore characters of neighboring peoples readily entering the world of the Dungan tale. For example, lamas, Buddhist monks, and Taoist monks, who can all identify shapeshifters and fight them with the help of different spells and other magical means. And on this particular slide, I'm featuring an image from a beautiful book titled Dungan Ornament and Album, compiled by Lojar Shinlaw in 1959. And this particular image is titled Human Figures. And finally, I'd like to make brief comments about color symbolism and then number symbolism. So red, in terms of color symbolism, red and green are seen as bright colors, scaring away evil spirits and protecting from adversity. For example, red and green are seen in the bride's attire and in the paint on the wagons and the horse harness before a long and treacherous journey. White is the color of mourning among the Dungans and the Chinese. White is also associated with fantastical animals. So, for example, a white snake, a white rabbit, or a white horse. And these are characters that typically help the hero. Black is a color mainly applied to negative characters and phenomena. For example, a black snake, a black whirlwind, a black fool as an abusive form of address for the Dragon King. Yellow is a color portending doom. So for example, mention of a yellow whirlwind carrying the heroine away, or a yellow countenance indicating contact with a vampire shapeshifter. And then blue and the closely related green are colors associated with dark forces. So for example, there is mention of a monster's blue or green face, mention of green smoke accompanying the appearance of a monster, or mention of the soul of the hero's enemy ascending into the sky with a trickle of blue smoke. And on this particular slide, I'm featuring another oil painting by Panshayev. And this particular painting is titled Remembrance, with all of its beautiful colors. Finally, I'd like to make just a few brief comments about number symbolism. So 3 is a number that is typical in the epic storytelling of various peoples and appears often in the Dungan folk narratives. 7 is also a number often mentioned, and this is more peculiar to Far Eastern folklore. 72 is another number that is often mentioned. And in this particular slide, I'm featuring another image from Shinlo's album, Dungan Ornament, an album. And this particular image is titled 3 Cranes in a Field, Peck Foxtail Millet. Finally, there is a frequent mention of 9 and its derivatives, especially 99. And often mentioned, for example, are 99 people destroyed by an evil monk in a tale, or 99 iron chariots thrown into a river by a hero warrior. With 9 as the base odd or masculine number that formed the basis for counting in ancient China. And then there is 40 as a number occupying a special place in Dungan folklore, apparently entering it from the Near Eastern cultural tradition. And here you may recall the Near Eastern tale, Ali Baba and the 40 Thieves. And the Dungan equivalent, stories of 40 viziers. And in the tales, you will encounter the hero performing, for example, for the Dragon King for precisely 40 days and nights. And then all kinds of events transpiring 40 days after a wedding or after the death of a hero's parents. And on this particular slide, I'm featuring another image from Shinlo's beautiful album. And you see the 9 ducks, and the caption for this particular image is "Ducks peck lotus flowers." And if you would like any further information about the Dungans, or about, for example, the 3 artists that I featured today, Panshayev, Karimov, and on this particular slide, a young female artist, Khalida Shimova, or about Shinlo and her beautiful album, you can please visit my website, which is on Georgetown Domains, and the URL is kjy.georgetown.domains. And hopefully you can stay around for the Q&A, and I would love to hear your questions and comments. And thank you all for being such a wonderful audience.
Thank you so much, Professor Yin. I am really, that was just super interesting, and it's super nice to be able to explore this, especially, for me, the linguistic aspects and the beautiful images. So thank you for those paintings that you shared with us as well. I see a few things in the chat already, and I'll start with those, but please do raise your hand if you'd like to unmute and speak. Alyona Bonova says, thank you for such a wonderful talk. It's amazing. Here are two questions, Dr. Yin. What's the number one dominating factor for folktales and legends in general? And Dungan as an example, and I'm trying to make sure I can read this. And Dungan as an example. So number one dominating factor in general, and Dungan as an example, is it's a language, a region of their localization, ethnicity of their creators, and or something else. And the second question is, what is in common for all folktales and legends? And I was hearing this myself, American, Russian, Dungan, etc. That's kind of a big question, but maybe you can start with that.
Yeah, sure. So thank you so much for the question, Alyona. The number one dominating factor for folktales and legends in general, I would probably say their relatability to the audiences, because they really can be read on different levels. So on a very basic level, there are just so many relatable characters and themes and settings that, where a child, I presume, could pick up, for example, this beautiful book of tales and really enjoy it, right? But on the other hand, if you're looking into the layers in terms of, for example, today, the cross-cultural influences that have come into these Dungan sort of folktales, being at the crossroads of Central Asia, there is so much there to explore, and it's such fertile ground for such rich and just fascinating discussion. So I would probably say that that's probably the dominating factor with these folktales and legends. And I think this factor of the relatability also of the tales is probably one of the main reasons that there is such popularity just in general, again, of folktales and legends, whether they're American or Russian or Dungan or Chinese or wherever they do come from, is because they are sort of such a accessible sort of reading material for people sort of all ages, and that can be enjoyed by anyone really, regardless of what their background may be in relation to the people whose literature and culture they are engaging with. But yeah, that's just such a wonderful question. Thank you so much for that.
Yeah, so I don't know if you saw that if you got to the second question about sort of folktales and legends that are the connections, but maybe what was more, maybe we could move to Cassandra Parkopti's question, which I really like a lot. She also thanks you for your great talk and says, what role, if any, have the governments of these Central Asian countries played in either ensuring the survival or suppression of this language and stories? And I guess I could extend that also to the Soviet question, which I'm sure you can easily address.
Yes, thank you so much for that question, Cassandra. So it's a wonderful question. So I guess the answer is not so easy to make, but during when the Soviets came along in the 20s, as we saw, there was an effort to, in some way, more generally for the Soviet Union to unite this sort of like coalition of all of the different ethnicities, including many of these minority ethnicities, and including those in Central Asia, like the Dungans, to use them to to aid this sort of the socialist agenda, so to speak. And so the Dungans, of course, were included in that, and there were efforts that were made, therefore, to give the Dungans some sort of standardized written system, which, as we discussed, the Dungans did not have until the first adoption of the Latin alphabet in the late 20s. And there were efforts that were made to, for example, perhaps do some of the teaching of the Dungan language in some of the schools, and preservation of the culture in some ways, and also promotion, therefore, in that way also of literature, and for the Dungans, the emergence of a Soviet Dungan literature, as well as development thereafter. However, I mean, it's an extremely complicated, though, issue, as anybody who is in the Russian and Eurasian studies know. This whole idea of this of the ethnic question, if you will, right? But what happened, though, more towards the 90s, in particular after the 90s, when after the collapse of the Soviet Union, was what was also experienced, unfortunately, with a lot of the other Soviet, East European, former Soviet states and Soviet bloc states, is that a lot of that support, which had been provided by the Soviet government, all of a sudden sort of disappeared. And there really was very little, if anything, published, for example, from the Dungan for a decade until the 2000s. And then since that time, it's been more of a struggle in terms of the, let's say, I guess your question deals with the survival of the language and support for maybe the literature, the written literature, because the peoples, including the Dungans, had been left more on their own to sort of come up with the funding sort of for that. So sort of, but I mean, it's there, but it's sort of touch and go, and it's sort of like the cultural organizations themselves, or for the Dungans, the Dungan Cultural Organization of Kyrgyzstan, of Kazakhstan, and the smaller association of Uzbekistan, in a lot of ways, have been responsible for that, and also for the funding of those activities. So as you can imagine, it's been a struggle in some ways, yeah. So in a nutshell, a sort of overview of that situation.
Sure. So we have a question here also from Sander Kapitz, who says, thank you so much again for the wonderful talk, Dr. Yin. You had mentioned that Dungan folk narratives involve petty traders and merchants. Were the traders and merchants ever depicted in a different light? Were traders and merchants not regarded as admirable professions within Dungan culture? That's a really interesting question.
Yes, thank you so much for that question, Sander. Yeah, so it's interesting because in there were many of both of these, as I mentioned, right? Of both the petty traders, as well as these small craftsmen. But in the tales, for some reason, there is not a lot of mention of the craftsmen, and this is brought out in the critical introduction by Riftin and Hasanov, and for some reason, but there were, of course, many of them before among the Dungans in terms of the craftsmen. But interestingly, there is frequent mention of the petty traders. So this would be the, for example, the small shop owners, and the just people walking around in the tales, walking around the villages, who are carrying the yoke and baskets and selling all different kinds of things, such as fabrics, decorations, and whatnot, out of their wagons. So yeah, that's sort of what what the information that I have based on the analysis that I've seen of that particular question.
Super. Well, this audience is behaving extremely well. They keep waiting for the end of a question and then they ask another one. So Morgan says, could you say something about the role folktales like these have played in the self-conceptions of distinction for Dungans in Soviet or post-Soviet Central Asia? To what extent is the significance of Dungan folklore to Dungan self-understanding a result of state constructions or framing of Dungan cultural content?
Oh, wow.
That's a good question.
That's a wonderful question. Yes, thank you so much, Morgan, for the question. That's such an interesting question. Yeah. So this Russian language edition, of course, was first published in 1977 and then came out in more recently, the other two editions in 2013 and 2018. There is in the analysis that's provided by Rifshin and his collaborators, there is a lot of attention that's paid sort of to the Chinese-ness, if you will, of these tales, and a lot of the influences that have come from, therefore, the Chinese in that sense, or the Hui, the Chinese sort of Muslims, and in my discussions and what I've heard from Dungans, they, in terms of how they see themselves, this whole idea of the self-understanding, what I've heard from the Dungans is a lot of times they actually view themselves today as more part of this Central Asian fabric. However, in terms in that sense, not to deny perhaps the Chinese-ness or the Chinese part of them, but I actually have heard that comment, and actually as I've been talking about the folktales and legends, that's which is interesting. But again, I mean, I guess maybe shouldn't be something that's necessarily unexpected, because the folk tales and these legends are reaching back centuries, of course, right, to well before the Dungans even arrived, right, in the late 19th century in Central Asia. So that Chinese-ness, in a way, or that Chinese influence, or the Hui sort of influence, goes back a lot further than is the history of the history of the Dungans themselves on the Central Asian territory. But it's such an interesting question, and that absolutely deserves much more research in terms of that. Very, very interesting, this whole idea of the self-understanding. Absolutely. But that's what I've heard.
Yeah, great. Well, thank you so much. Mark Bender also has a question. Again, thank you for the talk. I'm wondering about the present transmission of the tale. Is there still oral transmission of any sort in any language, or is it primarily written translation or other media? And also, how did you prepare yourself for this study, which I'm sure had many challenges as well as joys?
Right. Yes. Oh, yes. Thank you. Thank you, Professor Bender, for that particular question. Yeah. So, the present transmission of the tales. So there is, yeah, it's interesting because the tales ultimately are meant to be transmitted, and I think like many folk tales and legends, in an oral form, and also with performance aspects to them. And the Dungan tales are no exception to this. Yeah, unfortunately, we don't always get that when we just see a printed edition of the tales, right? But it's an important performance tradition among the Chinese, of course. Mark here with his class in Chinese performance art, and as well as for the Dungans. And I actually include information that was in the original 1977 Russian language edition about the Dungan storytellers. I actually translated and adapted the information that Riftin and his collaborators had provided in the 1977 edition. I gave a more compact sort of summary of the information about those storytellers and where they're from and their backgrounds and their professional history. So quite a few of them being professional storytellers. Yeah, and it's really an amazing sort of thing to sort of see if you do have a chance to sort of see it. But again, I guess, with the advent of the writing, it has become more difficult to find Dungans who are, and not just probably among Dungans, but among other peoples as well, who are, let's say, trained as professional storytellers. I think that does become sort of more challenging as time goes on, and everybody, all of this, these oral tales are put into a printed form. But Riftin and his collaborators in the mid to late 20th century were able to find quite a few professional storytellers that they were able to record the original Dungan tales from, and that they were able to, as the researchers, to translate from into the Russian. And just very, very briefly, I know we only have like 2 minutes, how I prepared for the study. Basically, I guess it was sort of my interest in the Dungan people and language originally, because I learned about the Dungans as a graduate student in linguistics when I was at Georgetown. And that eventually expanded into a broader interest, not just in the language and the linguistics, but into the culture and the history of the people, as well as the literature. And then my own background sort of in Chinese study, both academically and also as a heritage speaker of Chinese, of course, have helped immensely, as well as my academic background in Russian and East European and Eurasian studies, which has led me to the research that I'm doing now with the Dungans. But thank you so much for that wonderful question, and all of the questions. It's been so stimulating and interesting.
Well, that was when you brought up the recordings, I was going to ask you if you've had any chance to hear those recordings in the original of the original storytellers.
Yeah. Oh, what a wonderful question. Yeah, I wish I did have access to those, but I was able to get some of the original typescripts with sometimes written annotations on them from Riftin when I first made contact with him back in 2005, but not all of those typescripts are extant even at this point. A lot of them have been lost. And of course, the audio recordings, I didn't even ask, and he didn't even talk about those that he had made in the field. However, or if they even had been audio recorded, I should not even sure. Maybe they weren't even audio recorded in the field back in the 60s and 70s. But that would have been wonderful. But no, all I had access to was some of the typescripts. Yeah.
Are there any, I have one more question, but are there any
Sure.
other questions from the class or from the audience? I thought I might ask about contemporary Dungan writing. What do you know about non-folkloric or more literary writing?
Oh, well, thank you so much for that question, because I actually, my latest book is called Mystical Forest, and it's an English language edition of collected poems and short stories of Dungan ethnographer Ali Jean, who I was very fortunate to make contact with in 2015 through another Dungan researcher. And I found out that this, this ethnographer had actually been doing creative writing for, that straddled the late Soviet and then post-Soviet period. And I was able to get my hands on those like 103 poems, and then 4 of his short stories, and I made an edition from that. And just really, but there's been many other, of course, writers from the Soviet period, also post-Soviet period, that are sort of non-folkloric, right? And one of my other projects now is also a book called The Emergence and Development of Soviet Dungan Literature, and I'll be discussing a lot of those writers and some of their works. And you can go to my website now, and you can actually find some information about some of those ongoing projects. But there is a lot going on in terms of the Dungan literary world. Absolutely, a lot of interesting things, not necessarily related to the folklore. But thank you so very much. I know we're over time. Thank you so much for that question.
You mentioned that I just checked, and this book is indeed in our library. So not the second one, I don't think yet, but the first one. So anybody who hasn't explored it yet, you're welcome to go do so at the Ohio State Libraries. And if we don't have anything else, I want to just thank you for your generosity in sharing this passion of yours and your expertise with us. It's really been a delightful afternoon. Any other? Okay, great. Well, thank you. Thank you so much. And again, lovely to meet you.
Thanks, Kenneth. Really appreciated it.